Thank you very much. There's a great rabbinic tradition of giving remarks before one gives one's remarks, but I think that role has already been taken today, so with your permission, I will pretty much dive right in. I do want to acknowledge with gratitude the role of Dorshei Emet, its rabbis and congregants, in organizing this event. As some of you know, as I was on my own journey between movements in Judaism, for the years that I was at McGill, the first time I lived in Montreal, this was my spiritual home, and there are lessons that I learned here about community and intellectual engagement with Judaism at its best that I try always to carry with me. So thank you in particular to this community. So I want to begin with a story. And the story is of a conversation I had with one of our Introduction to Judaism students, one of those on the road to conversion. And she was telling me about the advice she got from a friend before going to pay a shiva call for the first time, before going to a home where a family was in mourning, before going to join them and extend her condolences. And so she says to me, well, my friend said, first you go in, the family's going to be sitting on low chairs, you go over, you extend your condolences, and you spend time talking to them, you spend time talking to the people there, she said, and then the prayers start, and all the women go to the kitchen. And so I want you to imagine what it is to be a woman who is a rabbi who goes in to lead those prayers, when the assumption of many in our community is that when the prayers start, the women go to the kitchen. And so my remarks here are prefaced on the premise that we do better when half of our population is not consigned to the kitchen. So here's the thing, listen, I'm glad that you're clapping. I'm kind of sad that we feel like we still have to, and that we are still having these conversations, and this may be a theme, thank you again, that comes up today. But for the most part, I say no to these panels and to these conversations because I get a little tired of being the woman rabbi, and I'm much more interested in being able to roll up my sleeves along with all my other colleagues and just being the rabbi. And that, I think, is where we are still, for better and for worse, a work in progress. And so the question that I have is how do we keep moving forward here in terms of being change makers, men and women together in our respective faiths? And the other piece that's important for me to say is that I'm not at all convinced that when we talk about changing a woman's place, bringing forward a woman's voice, that place or voice is in any way, shape, or form unitary. God help me, I have many male colleagues who are more soft-spoken and consensus-driven than I am in my own leadership style. So I, at least for myself, don't want to rely on some of those stereotypes that women's leadership, women's voices always manifest in certain ways. I think it's valuable to have our voices like it's valuable to have everyone's voices. And so what I want to share with you today is a few of the tools in my own toolbox that help me to navigate this terrain and hope that it will help to open and further some of the conversation that we share. So there are 4 tools I want to share with you in the few minutes I have. One is chutzpah, and I'll define it for those who may need. One is humility, one is humor, and one is hope. So chutzpah. What's chutzpah? Chutzpah is defined by the Jewish joke. Chutzpah is when someone kills his parents and then asks for the mercy of the court because he's an orphan. Chutzpah is that certain amount of audacity, which in our tradition can also be very holy, that lets us step forward and make our voices be heard, even when not always invited. That willingness to occupy new or previously unimagined space. And here I think it comes up for women's leadership in general, yes, but also for leadership at a senior level. We were having a bit of a conversation before about the stained glass ceiling, the system in which it's all right for a woman to be an assistant rabbi or an associate rabbi, but God forbid she be a senior rabbi. God forbid a woman be the president of the United States, for example, right? And what that tends to be limited by is a couple of things. One is that we just haven't seen it before, so we have trouble imagining it. And the other, I think, in a religious context in particular, is that we make the terrible mistake of imagining that our rabbis are stand-ins for God, and as long as we think that God is the guy with the beard on the cloud, the rabbi's got to be as close to that as possible, which I think both theologically and sociologically is a grave, grave, grave mistake. So how do you have the chutzpah to confront some of that? Part of it is, I think it helps to remind ourselves that it's not especially revolutionary to do what many of us do. It helps me that despite the fact that I'm Canadian born and bred and therefore used to some of the traditionalism of our communities, that I spent over a decade as a rabbi in New York City where, quite frankly, to be a lesbian rabbi, never mind a woman rabbi, is like a dime a dozen. Like you can't walk 10 city blocks before running into one of us. And so if you start off with that experience, even if other people are fascinated by your very existence, you kind of just want to move on past that and do what you spent all those years training and wanting to do. But the other piece of the chutzpah that I think is important is that although there are many barriers I have not faced, and I'll say more about that in a moment, there are certainly barriers we have faced, times that I at least ran into that wall, in my case within the conservative movement in Judaism, which at the time, no matter how good I was, how hard I worked, was not ordaining folks who were openly gay and lesbian at that time, and that prompted my own shift. But I think that experience of being on the outside, at its best, gives us not only more compassion for others who are excluded, but also more willingness and more of a sense of responsibility to advocate, to have that passion for advocating for others. I always remember a line from that very profoundly, I don't know, I'm going to say in the moment and tongue-in-cheek, profoundly Jewish and feminist TV show ER, which screened all those years ago, where one of the black characters who's a physician is told, you know, the world isn't getting better just because you're moving up in it. And that's something I always try and keep in mind in my own experience and in my own advocacy. So chutzpah first. I got to move through the others kind of fast. The second is humility. And here, too, there are two levels. The first for me is the recognition that I and we stand on the shoulders of giants, right? Many of the doors that have been opened to me in my personal and professional life, whether it was as a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford or in rabbinical school, or being able to marry a female partner, all of those are battles that others fought. And I came in on in the generation when many of those doors were open. Regina Jonas was ordained as a liberal rabbi in mid-20th century Germany. In the North American Reform movement, women have been ordained as rabbis for over 40 years. I had the privilege in the 80s and 90s of learning from Dr. Norma Joseph, who would be on all of those interminable Jewish feminist panels, and seeing a model of a woman who was a strong religious leader. So humility, I think, comes from that recognition that none of us are the first, I think, in our positions. Thank you. The other piece of humility is something that I think should be inherent to every religious or spiritual or communal leader, which is just that our work is fundamentally not about us. So I may be the face for certain values. I may have the great privilege of transmitting this beautiful ancient tradition and standing beside people in the peaks and the valleys of life. But if I make it about me, then I'm missing the point in a very fundamental way. And many of my compatriots who are asked to speak about these topics, we find ways very quickly to jump off of, so what's it like to be a woman, fill in the blank, to talking about the people and the causes and the traditions that really are what got us into this in the first place. The other piece of humility, I think I said 2, but I'm going to give you 3, also an old rabbinic trick, is that being a parent keeps me very humble, and I'm sure this is true for my male colleagues as well. I can give a sermon on Yom Kippur to hundreds, if not 1,000 people, and everyone will come up, Rabbi, great sermon, Rabbi, you changed my life, and I go home to my 2 kids and nobody listens to me and I can't do anything right. So that, I think, is advocacy for non-celibate religious traditions, whether or not we're talking about women as leaders. That gives me a good segue into the third tool in my toolkit, which is humor, both on the personal and professional level. But if we look in our religious traditions, my God, they're funny, and often with female characters. If you look at Balaam's famous or infamous talking donkey who sees more than the prophet, she is a female donkey. If you look at the wife of Manoach, who gets no name other than the wife of Manoach, but again manages to hear and act on God's word better than her husband, I think that part of the divine message in my religious tradition, at least, is that power and prophecy comes from the places we least often expect, that God has a tremendous sense of humor, and that if our lives don't surprise us, and if where we find ourselves every now and then doesn't shock us, and if we aren't constantly changing and chuckling at the changes we're pushed to make, then there too, I think we're making some theological mistakes. And so that's a tool that I use in every part of my life, and I find that if I go too long without laughing at myself and catching myself in my own mistakes, then I'm missing something. And that also helps with the chutzpah and letting certain things roll off one's back. The final piece that I want to speak about is hope. I believe that both the Jewish and feminist traditions are inherently hopeful traditions. I believe with those famous words of the Reverend Martin Luther King that the arc of the universe bends towards justice. I also think it isn't always obvious. It's certainly not automatic, that we are playing a long game, that as much as I want to feel like enough already, I've spoken about this before, I recognize that in the span of Jewish history and the span of human history, we are still in uncharted territory. And the greatest challenge, I think, is to keep looking forward instead of always looking over our right-hand shoulder at people who are moving more slowly than us, instead of always looking back. So it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without significant human effort. But the last piece of the hopefulness that I want to share from my toolkit is simply this, that I think that what you see on the bima, on the stage here, represents something that's inherently hopeful for the future of religion. We are in the most secular place in North America, sitting here in Quebec. You don't need me to tell you that. Every indicator shows it. The churches that are closing, the synagogues that are challenged, we know this is true. But speaking from my own experience, the one thing that we are not lacking as progressive religious folks is we are not lacking things to do. We are not sitting around twiddling our thumbs waiting for people to come in. So we may stress over fixing the leak in the roof and replacing the boiler because religion is struggling in ways that it hasn't before in our history. But I think that when we show that religion isn't what people think it looks like, that we are not the religious leaders of a generation or 2 generations before, it helps them find a way in. It helps them give a way to connect. It helps them say, maybe my deepest held modern values and my deepest held religious values can be lived with integrity in the same place, in the same community, in the same breath. And if our having these conversations helps us do that, then it's well worth doing. Thank you.